Hey, Thrilling Suspense fanatics. As we wrap up 2022, I thought it might be nice to give you guys a simple and delightful tale. Well, a dark and morbid tale, because that's what we do here. But without saying too much about it, let's get into Lloyd Alexander's The Sword of Dyrnwyn. The Sword of Dyrnwyn by Lloyd Alexander. When Ritta was crowned king of Prydain, the great sword of Dyrnwyn, fairest ever wrought, was given him in token of his kingship. Its hilt was gem-studded, its blade forged in a secret way of which the knowledge had been long lost. On its scabbard were graven these words: "Draw Dyrnwyn, only thou of noble worth, to rule with justice, to strike down evil. Who wields it in good cause shall slay even the Lord of Death." Of Dyrnwyn's lore and lineage little was known. King Ryderk Hale, sire of King Ryk and grandsire of Ritta, had been the first to bear it, and it was said that a deep enchantment had been laid upon it. So Ritta, in his turn, bore Dyrnwyn as a weapon of power and protection over the land. One day, Ritta and his nobles rode to the hunt. In the heat of the chase, Ritta galloped across the field of the old shepherd Amris, and by mishap broke the gate of his sheepfold. In dismay, Amris called out to Ritta, "King, I pray you, mend my gate. My arms are too weak, my hands tremble, and I have no strength to set new posts and raise it again." In his eagerness to follow the chase, Ritta hastily answered, "Shepherd, this is a small matter. You have my word, it will be made right." With that, seeing his nobles had gone on ahead, Ritta spurred his horse after them. All day he hunted, and at nightfall he rode back weary to his castle. There his counselors awaited him with such pressing business and so many urgent questions that he forgot his promise to the shepherd. Next morning, however, as Ritta rode out hawking, at the portal stood the shepherd, holding a young lamb in his arms. "King, mend my gate!" cried Amris, clutching Ritta's stirrup. Already my sheep have strayed, all but this one lamb." "Have I not given you my word?" answered Ritta sharply, angry with himself at forgetting, but angrier still that the shepherd dared reproach him before his nobles. "Yours are small cares, and will be set right in good time. Trouble me no longer with them." The hawk on the king's wrist beat her wings impatiently. Ritta kicked his stirrup free of the shepherd's hand and shouted for his hunting band to follow, and galloped on his way. That night, with plates filled and wine flowing, Ritta feasted in his great hall. Amid the laughter and boasting of his warriors and the music of his harpers, Ritta had no thoughts for his promise to the shepherd. Next day, Ritta held court with all his counselors and his war leader to consider matters of policy and high state. In the midst of the council, pulling free of the guards who tried to hold him back, Amris hobbled into the throne room and fell on his knees before the king. "King, mend my gate," he cried, holding out the body of the lamb. "I have honored you as a worthy king and an upright man, but now my sheep are lost, and, for want of its mother, my lamb is dead." "Shepherd," warned Ritta, "I commanded you to trouble me no more. How dare you come into my council? Grave affairs are being weighed here." "Sire," answered the shepherd, "is it not a grave thing when a king's promise goes unkept?" "What, shepherd?" Ritta burst out. "Do you tell me I have been false to my word?" "No, sire," the shepherd returned simply. "I only tell you that so far it has not been kept."
Ritta's face reddened at being so reproved, and he rose angrily from his throne to answer, "Shepherd, mind your tongue. Do you call your king an oath-breaker?" "You say it, sire, not I," replied Amrys. These words of the shepherd so kindled his wrath that Ritta drew his great sword and struck down Amrys. But then, when his rage lifted, and he saw he had slain the old man, Ritta was filled with remorse. He flung aside the weapon, and covered his face with his hands. However, his counselors gathered around him and said, "Sire, that was a grievous deed. Nevertheless, the shepherd brought it on himself. He gave you a mortal insult, calling you a liar to your face. This affront to your majesty could have grown to treason and open rebellion. You could have done nothing else." At first, Ritta had blamed only himself, but the more his counselors spoke, the more their words eased his mind, and he saw the matter in their light. So, putting aside his regrets, he willingly agreed. "Yes, it is true and clear to me now. I did only my duty. Even so, to show I bear no grudge, see to it the shepherd's wife and family are given each a purse filled with gold, and the finest ram and ewe of my own flock, and never are they to want for anything whatsoever." All the court hailed Ritta's wisdom and generosity, but that night, in his bedchamber, when he laid aside his weapons, on the bright scabbard of Dyrnwyn, he saw a dark stain, the black of dried blood. Try as he would to wipe the scabbard clean, the dark stain remained. Next day his chief counselor came and told him, "Sire, we would have done your bidding, but the shepherd has neither wife nor family. Indeed, he has no kindred to inherit his land." Ritta's war leader, hearing this, came forward and said to the king, "Sire, it has been your custom to reward those who serve you well. Before, when land was left without an heir, you bestowed it on other lords. Will you give this holding to me?" Ritta hesitated, weighing the war leader's request, but thinking too how well the shepherd's land would increase his own domains. Then he said, "The shepherd affronted me. It is only justice that his land be added to mine." "Justice?" retorted the war leader. "The king's justice well serves the king's ends." Ritta turned angrily upon him and exclaimed, "It will be as I said. How dare you question me? Do you reprove your king? Take warning from the shepherd's fate." "Do you threaten a companion's life?" the war leader flung back, his lips white with rage. "No, Ritta. You have a warrior to deal with, not a weak old man. You, sire, take warning yourself." At this, Ritta struck the war leader across the face and cried, "Be gone! Do you covet more land? For your insolence, your own lands are forfeit. I banish you from court and from castle and from all my realm." Seeing Ritta's fury, neither the counselors nor any of the nobles dared gainsay the king. So the war leader was sent away in disgrace and his place given to another. That night, in his bedchamber, when he laid aside the sword, Ritta saw the stain had not only darkened but spread, until it covered still more of the scabbard. Again he tried to wipe it away, but the stubborn stain remained and grew larger. Alarmed, he gave the weapon to his master swordsmiths, but even they could not scour it clean. Now, at this same time, many nobles, witnesses to the war leader's disgrace, began muttering among themselves. The king's injustice rankled them, and they feared his wrath might fall heavily upon them, too, and strip them of their own lands and honors. So they swore to rise against the king and overthrow him. But Ritta had word of their plan, and even as they gathered to do battle, Ritta and his war band rode out and set upon them, taking them by surprise. As it happened, the place of battle was none other than the field of Amrys the shepherd, and Ritta, leading his warriors, suddenly cried out in horror. There, before his eyes, stood the shepherd, bloody with wounds, holding out the lamb to him. The king's warriors, seeing nothing, took Ritta's outburst as a battle cry. They galloped to a fierce charge, slew most of those who stood against them, and put the rest to flight. Ritta, however, had reined his horse and turned from the fray. With all speed he rode back to his castle and lay trembling in his chamber, certain the shepherd had meant to work some evil upon him. When his warriors brought him word of the victory and asked if he had been wounded and therefore had not led the onslaught, Ritta dared not speak of what he had seen. Instead, he told them that he had been stricken with a sudden fever and sickness, but he could not keep the shepherd from his thoughts. He deserved his fate, Ritta repeated to himself, as do all who have risen against me. Let their lands too be forfeit, and their goods and gold be added to the royal treasure. But now the stains spread farther and blotted nearly all the scabbard. Again, Ritta ordered his swordsmiths to find a means of scouring it. They could not. The metal is flawed, Ritta cried. The sword is ill-made. At the same time, uneasiness filled his mind. Now he believed the sight of Amrys had been an omen and a warning of more treachery, and so he called his counselors, war leader, and captain of his war bands, saying, "All our enemies are not yet overcome, and the danger to the kingdom is even greater. The kinsmen of those traitors will surely seek vengeance. It may be they plot against me even now. It may be they bide their time, waiting for a day when they shall rise and strike me unawares. Better that I crush them before they can rally in strength and set upon me." So Ritta commanded his war bands to arm at dawn and be ready to seek out the traitors' kindred and to slay them. That night, however, Ritta turned and tossed on his couch, and long before dawn he woke at the sound of a voice murmuring in his chamber. He started up, sweating in terror, to see the shepherd holding the lamb in his arms, standing at the foot of the couch. And Amrys spoke and said, "Remember the broken gate, sire. Remember the lost sheep. The path you follow leads you, too, astray. Mourn the dead by pitying the living." The shepherd would have spoken further, but Ritta, unheeding, sprang up with a great cry, seized Dyrnwyn, and made to snatch the blade from its sheath. But the scabbard held the blade with jaws of iron. In fear and rage, Ritta clawed at the weapon and tore at it until his fingers were bloodied. He could not draw the sword. When his guards ran to him with torches, he ordered them away, saying only that he had a bad dream. But in the morning, while his warriors stood by their horses, awaiting him to mount and ride at the head of the battle host, Ritta summoned his war leader and told him, "I have thought on this, and see it is not fitting for a king to show concern in such a matter. Were I myself to lead the host, there would be those to say I judged the danger greater than it is, or even that I had no trust in my officers. Therefore, go and do my bidding, as it seems best to you, in any way you choose." Then Ritta withdrew to his chamber, never daring to tell the true reason behind his words. "It is written on the scabbard," thought Ritta, "Draw Dyrnwyn, only thou of noble worth. Since the blade will not come freely to my hand, my warriors may believe their king is unworthy to rule." The more he stared at the inscription, the more the words of it mocked him. With a curse, Ritta seized a dagger and tried to scratch away the graven message. Though he marred some of the letters, the engraving remained and stood out all the brighter against the scabbard. Then Ritta flung aside the dagger. Clutching the sword, he crouched trembling in a corner of his chamber, his eyes glittering feverishly, his glance never at rest. Soon his war leader came to him and said, "Sire, the kinsmen of our enemies are slain, and all their families, their wives and mothers, their children, and any who might claim blood kinship with them." Ritta nodded vaguely as if he had not heard, and murmured, "You have done well." Afterward, Ritta looked again at Dyrnwyn. It had turned altogether black. That night, although he slept behind barred and bolted doors, he woke to the sound of weeping, and once more saw the shepherd, who turned an anguished face upon him and called out, "Sire, find yourself before you lose yourself." Ritta stopped his ears against these words, but even the coming of day did not dissolve his nightmare, and the empty chamber echoed the shepherd's weeping. "Another omen!" cried Ritta. "Another warning that all my enemies are not yet slain. All must be found and killed, or I shall lose my kingdom." So he commanded his war bands to hunt down any who had ever befriended the kinsmen of his enemies, any who had spoken favor of them, and any who did not praise the worthiness of his kingship. Even this brought him no peace. While Ritta stayed in his chamber, his warriors roved the kingdom unchecked, putting many to the sword, with or without cause, having more thought now to seizing treasure than finding treachery. However, instead of striking terror in the hearts of Ritta's foes, such deeds only enraged them and gave them the courage of despair. Where before there had been few, now arose many who are joined to fight against the king, and Ritta's nightmares, instead of easing, grew more terrible. He feared to stay alone in his chamber, and feared to leave it. Sure some hand would strike him down, even amid his bodyguard. So Ritta commanded new chambers made for him deep underground, with heavy doors and thick walls. At the same time, he ordered his henchmen to stand circling his couch with drawn swords and keep watch over him. Now, each night, Ritta slept in a different chamber. Not even his counselors could be certain where to find him. Next, he commanded other rooms to be built, with hallways, tunnels, and galleries, winding and crossing, twisting and turning in a pattern he alone could fathom. Thus the stronghold became known as the Spiral Castle. Even then, Ritta was unsatisfied. He commanded his builders to dig still deeper, until they could go no farther. There they hewed a chamber out of living rock, in which he heaped great stores of provisions, treasures of gold and goods, coffers of jewels, robes of rich fur, and stacks of finely wrought weapons. He raised a high couch, where he lay with the black sword at his hand. At last Ritta was content. No enemy could find him, no battle host breach the walls. Even so, he ordered his warriors to stand about him with naked blades. That night he went easily to sleep, but soon, as before, anguished murmuring aroused him. There stood the shepherd, his wounds running red, staining the fleece of the lamb he carried. The warriors, sure no danger was possible, had fallen asleep on the floor. Ritta would have cried out in alarm, but his voice turned to stone in his throat as Amrys drew closer. "Wretched king," came the shepherd's sorrowing voice, "alas, you would not heed me. You slew me once for a broken gate, but you have slain yourself 100 times over. King, I pity you as I would pity any suffering creature." The shepherd reached out a hand as if he would touch Ritta's brow. Seeing this, fearing that Amrys meant to strike him, Ritta found his voice again and shrieked in terror. At the same time, bending all his might, straining every sinew into a final effort, he clutched the hilt of Dyrnwyn and strove to rip it from the scabbard. He shouted in triumph as the blade came free. But he had unsheathed only a hand's breadth of the blade when tongues of white flame burst crackling from the hilt and all the length of the scabbard. Where before he had been unable to draw the weapon, now he could not unclench his fists and cast the blazing sword away. Like a lightning bolt, the flame filled the chamber in an instant, striking down even the guards who staggered to their feet. Then, as suddenly as it had risen, the flame was quenched. Still gripping the blackened sword in his lifeless hands, King Ritta fell back on his couch, and all was silent. Because no one could find a way through the tunnels and galleries, Ritta lay as he had fallen. In time, having no word of him, his counselors and courtiers at last knew him to be dead, and only the shepherd Amrys ever grieved for him. The end. I think this story to be an elegant, moral fable. Absolute power corrupts absolutely, and furthermore, when we do something wrong, our attempts to cover up or to deny our wrongdoing often compound whatever initial wrongdoing we've done. And here we see that principle played out. So this story is relatively simple, without layer after layer of complex metaphor, without, great Clark Ashtonian vocabularizations or, strange words or long-running descriptions, and that's okay. Sometimes a simple story hits just right. Thanks for listening, and thanks for checking out my own work, my magazine Thrilling Suspense Fantasy with its classic comics and pulps, available in the link in the description box below. All right, take care and see you in the next video.